Hi, everybody. I'm Martin Gegg from the Brooklands Members Committee. And today I've got with me Terry Wright, who's written this wonderful book here, Speed Monarch, The Short Life of Eric Fernihough, the world's motorcycle speed record. And he's here to talk a bit about it. So, hi, Terry.
Hi, hi.
So, tell us a bit about yourself, Terry.
Well, I was by trade or profession an architect. Um, I was born in Northern Ireland. I grew up in England, and eventually I travelled to Australia with my wife and family for a couple of years, as you could then do, courtesy of the Australian government, and could go home without having to pay your fare. But that was the 1970s, and it wasn't a particularly good time to come back to the UK. So I stayed, and in the meantime, I'd got very involved in historic motorsport in Australia, which was then really just getting going, and with quite a few years involvement in motorcycles of one kind or another, and particularly Morgan three-wheelers and Jap engines and so forth. I had spent most of my time doing Morgans and eventually historic motorcycles.
Okay, yes, for the viewers and listeners, I should mention that it's early in the morning here and mid-evening there, I guess.
After dinner, yes.
Yeah,
This is a sort of after dinner talk for me.
yeah, great. Okay, so that's the great thing about Zoom. We can connect with anybody anywhere. So that's good.
Sure.
So just to let everybody know who doesn't know anything about this book, it's I'd call it a weighty tome. I weighed it, and it was over 2 kilograms.
That's
So
correct. And it's a bit
yeah,
expensive to post.
yes. But it's a wonderful book, and I thought that it would be good to find out a bit about the process of how it got put together, and also about, of course, Fernihough, who it's all about. And perhaps I could ask you first how you started your interest in Fernihough in particular.
Well, I think it was through my involvement in Morgan Three Wheelers, and it's possibly not very well known that he was very active with the Morgan Three Wheeler when he was at university. And so when I first got my own car as a student and started to learn a little bit about the history of the things, one of the names that popped up was Eric Fernihough, and as I learned a little bit more about him, I got more and more curious about how a guy who was apparently well bred and came from quite a wealthy background, even if it was as an adopted child, um, how he had become so passionate for motorcycles. It didn't fit the normal sort of picture of a motorcyclist. He had a degree from Cambridge. He went to public school. Um, and so I just became more and more curious about him. And then taking a leap in time, about 2015, I researched, wrote, and published a book specifically about the V-twin engine Cooper racing cars. And in the course of researching that, I found, to my surprise, that there was a mass of material about Eric Fernihough in the Brooklands Museum. And although I didn't use very much of that in my Cooper book, I realised that he was an absolute treasure trove and a story that I felt had to be told. So when I finished the Cooper book, one of the first things I did was get into Brooklands and see what there was there in more detail.
Okay.
And then, as part of our annual trips to Europe, my wife and I went to Hungary, and we visited the site of his of his death, the site of his world record too, of course, and it went on from there. It just grew and grew and grew.
Okay, yeah, because before I'd read the book, Fernihough was, to me anyway, he was like one of the posh guys who'd been to public school. There were two sort of bands of people that occurred to me. There were the rich guys who had the money, and then there were the worker riders who were out there every day testing bikes and that sort of thing for a few bob. And he fell into that, very much that sort of posh camp. But actually, it didn't start like that, did it? So tell us about his early
No,
life.
yes. Well, he was an orphan. Um, his his mother uh, died shortly after, not too many years after he was born, in during the birth of a daughter, and by that point in his life, his father appeared to have abandoned the family, and all the children who were still at under working age were housed in an orphanage in somewhere on Merseyside. We don't exactly know where. And as each of these children became of working age, they were shipped off to Canada on a scheme that dealt with orphans and sent them somewhere where their labour was needed. In the Fernihough family's case, they all went to Canada, but there was a similar scheme in sending people to Australia as well. It's a very controversial bit of history. But anyway, Eric was most fortunate in that he was adopted by a rich widow who was looking for a child to keep her company, I suppose. And that was basically how Fernie fell on his feet.
So I'm going to ask an impossible question now. Because of his passion of motor cars and motorcycles, if he hadn't been adopted and taken that route, do you think that would have ever still developed, or is it impossible to say?
I think it's almost impossible to say. I think it's probably unlikely, simply because if he hadn't been adopted in that way, he probably would have never had their life that allowed him the sort of funds that were necessary to become a serious motorcyclist. He would have ended up on a farm or stationed somewhere in Canada, and probably would never have the funds to get going. And there's no question that his business success and also his motorcycling success was to some extent funded by his mother.
When did you start the book?
Well, I think it was 2017. I went to Hungary, where he was killed, and I should perhaps explain at the time we were, although we lived in Australia, we'd still maintained a lot of links with the UK, and indeed for quite a few years I had one of two cars, both with V-twin chap engines, over in the UK, and I was doing regular hill climb seasons over there, and as part of all of that, we had a motorhome. So in the summer of 2017, we made the trip to Hungary to see the site of Eric's records and indeed his death. And we met and were made very welcome by some Hungarian enthusiasts who'd researched the history of a certain stretch of road in Hungary, which had been specifically designed for record breaking. And this stretch of road was part of a program that had rather optimistically been put together in the 1930s to build a tourist route between London and Istanbul, or Constantinople, as might then have been called, with the idea that there would be an extension to Cape Town and to Calcutta. All seems rather optimistic, but one of the things that came out of this, in particular, was a set of standards for road construction. And the idea was that the countries on this route would build their bit of the route to this set of standards of grade and width and detail. And in fact, there's rather a fine book published by the Automobile Association, which a copy of which is in the Museum of Bewley, that illustrates all of these standards. And it's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book. So anyway, one of the few bits of this optimistic venture that actually got built was a stretch of road south of Budapest on the Hungarian plain. And at the time, the not royal, but the Hungarian equivalent of the Automobile Association, or the RAC, was quite influential politically. And in the course of the Hungarian government deciding that it was going to build a stretch of this road from London to Istanbul, the Hungarian club managed to persuade the government to build part of the road to a standard that would be suitable for world records. And so what in fact got built as a bypass for the little settlement of a place called Guillaume was 6 and a bit kilometres stretch of dead straight road that was very, very carefully designed and constructed so that it was as smooth as possible. And that became the site of annual and other record sessions. And it was to that Eric turned when he needed someone to go for when he became interested in record breaking. But that's jumping ahead a bit. I think we still should be talking about Eric in his earlier days.
Yeah. And just on a side note, going off a tangent, it's interesting that one of our motorcycle team who was a racer, he's passed away now, but he used to race in Czechoslovakia, and he was very well known in Czechoslovakia, but not really known in this country. It's a weird situation.
That's very similar to Eric.
And one of the things I was going to ask you, actually, another of my interests is the early record breaking days. And when they were talking about reaching 100 miles an hour at Brooklands and all this sort of thing. And perhaps you can tell us a bit about why they grew out of Brooklands and onto the long roads of Europe.
Brooklands eventually was too small and too bumpy. At some point, and I forget exactly when, but it was somewhere in the mid-20s, it was ruled out of world records because of the practice that had very naturally developed of people riding high around the members' banking. That's the banking to the north, and using the downhill slope of the banking to accelerate along Railway Straight. And at some point, the International Federation, known for short as the FICM, actually prohibited any more record breaking at Brooklands.
The process actually, which interests me about actually gathering all the information. So you develop the interest, and I'm pretty sure that I had an early input into this book because I dug out the Brooklands Society index with all the references of Fernihough and sent them to somebody in Australia, and I guess that was you.
Well, that was yes, that was that must have been me. And in fact, at some stage, I was also given a copy of the complete index, which is a very valuable document. It must be about a centimetre thick. But yes, indeed, I did get that. The process of researching the whole thing started as with my visit to Hungary, and I found that there was a group of people there who were very enthusiastic about this particular stretch of road and its broader history in terms of speed record breaking, which of course included cars and so forth. And it was active for about 5 or 6 years before the Second World War. And one of the people involved had actually written a history of the road and its role in record breaking, both Hungarian and worldwide. So that, in essence, was my starting point. I'd been to the place. I'd seen the site of the fatal accident, and then we were on our way. And on my way back from Hungary, we visited the BMW archives in Munich and made contact there, and were assured of support. And I met a chap called Fred Jacobs, who's in charge of the archives. And in conversation, he said, "Oh, by the way, I think you ought to know there's a chap in Germany who's got quite a few record bikes, including some that were very well known at Brooklands." So we then visited him, and his name was Dieter Muschler. He lives on Lake Constance, which is down in the south of Bavaria, and he has an extraordinary collection of motorcycles. I would hesitate to guess, and it can only be a guess because I haven't seen anything similar, but I would imagine it would be one of the best private collections of motorcycles in the world. But most importantly, what he did was have an extraordinary library and archive. So that immediately became an opportunity to do more research. Unfortunately, nowhere in Australia or New Zealand is there a complete collection of, say, motorcycle or motorcycling magazines. There's plenty of access to newspaper archives, but all those magazines must have had them, and they must have thrown them all out. So from the point of view of living in Sydney and only once a year visiting the UK and Europe, the research task was potentially quite difficult. But one of the things that Dieter had was a complete set of motorcycle and a complete set of motorcycling, plus a complete set of this and that, and German magazines and American magazines as well. So that was to be of an extraordinary advantage, particularly when we came to the COVID years, and it wasn't possible to visit the UK for several years at a time. So with the potential assistance of the BMW archives, and they had most of the papers of the great record hero Ernst Henner, with access to the key journals, plus a variety of papers via Dieter Muschler's collection. And then the real gem, which I'd found about during the course of working on my Cooper book, was what was and is at Brooklands Museum. Because when Eric Fernihough died, or was killed, I should say, his wife sold the garage, and she moved into quite a large house in Byfleet. She wasn't short of a penny, and she obviously kept all Ferni's papers. And Ferni, being an educated man and a businessman, was pretty well organised in terms of his documents and his files and so forth. And his widow kept them all, as she kept all his trophies, as she kept a variety of things that Ferni had. And when she died, I forget exactly, I think it was early 1980s, strangely, she didn't seem to have left a will. And the proceeds of her estate went to what I presume to be some distant family member in the north of England. And they presumably didn't have any particular interest in the contents of the house, because as these things happen, it went to a commercial firm or people who cleared it. I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true, but I understand the Brooklands Society managed to retrieve a large quantity of Fernihough's trophies from a skip that was outside the house at the time it was being cleared. And those trophies can be seen today in Brooklands Museum. Anyway, whether that the particulars of the skip are correct or not, I don't know. But what we do know is that those trophies are in Brooklands Museum, many of them having been donated by the Brooklands Society. But from my point of view, most importantly, there were a very large quantity of Fernihough's papers and documents and correspondence and results and newspaper cuttings and so forth. And that was just an absolute treasure trove. Clearly, there was a mass of material now available, and I made the decision to start the book, which I did very slowly, I suppose, over 2018. And then not long after that, COVID struck. So from the point of view of going to Europe to do further research and to access the material, both in the Muschler archive and at Brooklands, it just wasn't possible. But fortunately, I had copied a great deal of the material at Brooklands Museum. When I say copied, I just photographed it. It's that simple. These days, you just take a photograph and you don't have to worry about scanning or anything like that. Dieter Muschler kept me fed with material all through COVID. So basically, all I had to do was ask him for a magazine article, and within 24 hours, he would send it to me. So now I had not only been to the site of the records, I had access to the BMW archives. I had access to all the relevant magazines and, of course, newspapers online. And I had access, sometimes secondhand, to a great body of Fernihough's personal papers about his life and his racing and his record breaking.
So the personal papers, Were they in various places or were they at Brooklands?
Practically everything I found personally was at Brooklands. Um, there was a certain amount of material that was not at Brooklands and was in private hands, and I was able to acquire um, some of this. I mean, again, these things, I guess you make your own luck. In the course of talking and asking questions and emailing people and writing to people, I became aware of two sets of material uh, from Ferni's papers, which weren't at Brooklands, and I managed to acquire both of those for small sums of money. I mean, one basically was his car racing file, and he had definite plans to go car racing, and he bought a car in the mid 30s, quite a well known MG, and he didn't pursue that in the end. He sold it. But for example, I've got his file on car racing, and there's a couple of other things I've got. I've got one of his photo albums. I've also got his press cuttings book about 1934-35. He started subscribing to a press cutting service, and that was made up into an album, and I've got that. But what I have personally is very, very modest compared with what's at Brooklands Museum.
Well, just to help everybody understand how challenging it can be when I wrote my book about pioneer military motorcycling, you find yourself having to, as you say, you go around the archives and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I've said in the review of your book is that reading the book, it's rather like having somebody go into the archive and lay out all the documents in front of you in order, and for you to be able to just view them without having to go to all these places. Absolutely wonderful. And the images and the photographs are absolutely stunning. The treatment of the photographs is such that they all appear to be the same, but they haven't been messed about with, and they're very, clean and clear and crisp. Was there anything special that went on with the photographs?
Well, the photographs are very mixed. In some cases, they are simply quite small photographs in magazines. Particularly some of the earlier ones are from motorcycle or motorcycling. Fortunately, these days we're blessed with some wonderful computer technology, and I might, if you would like, I might just briefly outline the process of producing the book. I mean, let's assume we've done most of our research. We've got about 90% of the story. Well, the first thing you do is design a structure for the book, what the chapters are going to be and what they're going to do contain. And by the time you've done a lot of your research, that tends to fall into place. The next stage is pretty straightforward. You write it. You write it as best you can, and for some people that probably comes easy. For some others, it probably comes harder. And I'm somewhere in the middle. So you end up with, in my case, I suppose it eventually came to well over 100,000 words, probably 120, 130,000 words in some sort of cohesive arrangement. And what do you do then? Well, you have to have a layout, you have to have a design, you have to have an idea for the architecture of the page. And I've always often felt that most motoring books are far too big. I mean, if you can't comfortably read it in bed, it doesn't really count as a book to me. And they also tend to be quite hard to read. They're 2 or 3 columns to a page, and text is all over the place, and it doesn't flow like a novel or a biography and so forth. So I've adopted the principle of easily readable text and a page size that's not too big. And I have an idea of a general grid into which would be fitted text and photographs. And once you've got all your text written and corrected and proofed, then you have to turn it into pages. And fortunately, these days we have book design software that makes that relatively straightforward. And you have a series of boxes that fit the grid that you decided upon, and into some of those boxes you flow the text, and into other boxes or potential boxes you insert photographs, and eventually it all sort of comes together. Now, as far as photographs are concerned, we've also got some wonderful technology, in particular a program called Adobe Photoshop, with which a skilled operator can work absolute magic. And one of the good fortunes, as far as I'm concerned, is my daughter is quite skilled. One of my daughters is quite skilled in that, and she's always been only too happy to help. So she did, once I'd put the text where it ought to be, and once I'd put the photographs where I wanted them to be, then she took over, and she did all the final detailing, and particularly turned her attention to the quality of the photographs. And the software now uses artificial intelligence technology to do things like automatically or semi-automatically improve the relationship between various parts of a photograph and so forth. And if you have a photograph in a magazine, which is quite coarse, made up of dots, as most old newspapers and magazines were so constructed, the artificial intelligence technology will smooth it all out. So you can have quite a coarse photograph in a 1908 copy of motorcycling, and it can be turned into something quite good. And also all the blemishes and so forth can be removed. So the quality of the photographs, in many cases, is because of that technique, and my good fortune in having access to a skilled operator.
Yeah, and also whilst we're dealing with images, just one particular document that just jumped out at me and placed me right in with Fernihough was his notebook, which you've got some pages there of how when he was very young, even from an early day, he would test bikes and cars and vehicles in general, I think, and do a write-up of them, and it's absolutely wonderful.
Well, I thought that was one of the great treasures of the collection at Brooklands, and I thought it was also very revealing of Fernihough, the man. I mean, one of the problems writing something at this distance in time is there's nobody alive that knew him, as far as I know. Clearly, he's long gone. you wouldn't find very much to be said about him personally, other than obviously the favourable comments that one would make on somebody's demise. So it's really quite hard to get under the skin of a person. But when you see something like Fernihough's early notebooks, and we're talking of when he was, I think he must have been 15 or 16, no more than that. And he was doing road tests. And I don't know where all these cars and motorcycles came from. I've surmised that one of his mates had a father who was in the motor trade, because there seemed to be a never-ending succession of cars and motorcycles that were being lent to Ferni in order to do these write-ups, which is what he did. So there's this quite substantial notebook of road tests, all done by a 15 or 16-year-old.
And of course, it's not just the road test, is it? It's wonderful drawings.
Oh, yes, yes. And his first visit to Brooklands, which I think was 1920 or 1921, and his impressions. And in particular, there's a tour of Wales that he did with his mother in her Morgan, which I don't think she ever drove, but he certainly did. And some wonderful accounts of what seemed like a never-ending succession of punctures and nails found in the road and pieces falling off and so forth. So from that source, that was a source of a very rich description of ordinary motoring in the early 1920s.
Yeah, and as you say, I read pieces in motorcycling magazines at the time, and they talk about the people, but you don't know whether there's a bit of self-publicity for some people. There's a bit of like or dislike by the journalists or whatever, but actually looking at that document and seeing what he's written and he's drawn and his designs and all that sort of stuff, it just places you, as you say, right in the mind of the man.
Yes,
it's wonderful.
And he was very busy designing his own motorcycles and so forth. Yes, a wonderful resource, and there are several of those notebooks in Brooklands Museum, and they're real treasures. They're real treasures.
What I wanted to suggest to you, that your book is actually two stories, really. It's the story of Fernihough, but it also is the story of record breaking, in that you place Eric in the context of record breaking from its inception, or on two wheels in its inception, right the way through to the 1930s. And I don't think there's anything else out there that does that. So well done.
Thank you. Thank you. It seemed to me that the two things went together. I mean, I couldn't. The period of record breaking, which is basically, or record making, that I've written about, is from about 1900, which is only 3 or 4 years before Ferni was born, until the Second World War, which is more or less when Ferni was killed. And I couldn't really think of a way of writing about the record breaking without knowing more about the personalities. And of course, in the case of Eric Fernihough, we had access to a lot of information about him. And what I should say is also there's a parallel set of information in the BMW archives about the great Henner, who was, I suppose, Fernihogh's principal rival for the absolute world record in the late 1930s. In the case of the Henner material, it's in the form of albums that were put together by his wife, and it's almost equivalent to the Fernihough material. So in order to write about Fernihough and records, um, uh, one had to do the German side of things as well. And that sort of naturally extended then into, well, what happened before these guys came along? And before you know, you're back before the First World War, before there were any official records. And you're trying to work out, well, who was the fastest? And in the absence of any official records, um, who do you say was faster than who? And I've, in the absence of any official records until about 1921, I came up with a definition of what I thought was could reasonably be called the world's fastest. I have a definition of what I consider that to be, and essentially it was a time that was recorded by qualified officials at an event that was accessible to the public, and which is reported in newspapers or magazines without known dissent.
One of the things that I found, I've written some articles, as you may know, in the Brooklands Bulletin about some of the early record breaking with Collier and
Yes.
those sort of people, and in the very beginning. And of course, what I found really difficult was the fact that there's no real records of records in Brooklands Library. They've only got the races. And so you're having to go through the motorcycle press. But in doing that, you get some wonderful stories, and there's some incredible drama in there. And you brought out some of those stories like Collier versus De Rossa and all these things that could be turned into wonderful films going right the way through to the 1930s.
I think there's a great movie to be made about
several, I think.
Yes. Yes, I think so.
You know, there's the early Collier days, and then there's the Burt Denley days, and the others, and the Fernihough into the 30s and the long straight roads of Europe. And it's absolutely wonderful. So perhaps we can talk a bit now about streamlining and how Fernihough, there's his name is associated by pictures. If you put in a Google search of him, you inevitably get a picture of him posing on his bike at Brooklands with all the streamlining on. So yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Well, nobody knew very much. Some of the fundamentals were known in the early 1900s, but it really didn't go much further than the general notion that the best streams shape from streamlining purposes was that of a teardrop, and I don't think there was any serious scientific investigation of streamlining probably until the 1920s, or perhaps a little bit earlier. And certainly one of the pioneering efforts was associated with airships and particularly Zeppelins, which came to the fore during the First World War, and it then there's, to the best of my knowledge, there's no serious history of the science of the development of the science of streamlining, but it was very much a business of suck it and see, and the application of a fair amount of common sense. And to the best of my knowledge, there wasn't any serious effort to streamlined cars before about the 1920s, and I attempt to go into the history of that in the book, but I've probably only touched the surface of it. As far as streamlining was concerned, there was a certain amount of knowledge and a great deal of guesswork. But the particular problem of the motorcycle is that it has to keep moving, otherwise it falls over, and it's basically unstable obstacle, and without that forward motion, it just falls over. The dynamics of all of that are now understood, but they certainly weren't in those days, and certainly I don't understand them now. One of the principal consequences of not getting right was was then and is still called the tank slapper. That's a violent oscillation of the front wheels, and despite all the care that goes into motorcycle design, you can, if you just go to YouTube and search for tank slapper, you'll see some quite horrifying, awful examples of that. But there were some rules that had been developed, and one of the critical ones was that the relationship between the center of gravity of the moving object and the center of pressure, which is where the wind forces act, and the center of pressure for stability basically has to be behind the center of gravity, and that's what happens when you have an arrow flying through the air. It's got fins at the blunt end, and they are the function or the role of those fins is to move the center of pressure back behind the center of gravity. Now, whether that wasn't very well understood in the 1920s and the 1930s, and it was absolutely critical from the point of view of stability of a motorcycle. A modern record motorcycle, is, you may have noticed, is very long, and when there's a considerable distance between the front and the rear wheels, then there's much more freedom to adjust the positions of the center of gravity and the center of pressure. So all the principal record seekers of the 1930s had problems with stability. Only in Fernihough's case did it become fatal. But whether any of this was really understood at the time, I simply don't know. I think Fernihough had a very bad experience not long before his final effort, and he did write to one of his friends about it, and there was a clear idea that he was venturing completely into the unknown. When he actually took his world record in 1937, he'd actually removed most of the streamlining that he'd had specially built because he'd found it made the vehicle unstable. He rebuilt that streamlining for 1938, and that was when he was killed. He went into a tank slapper, couldn't control it. In fact, I don't think a tank slapper is controllable. Certainly not in those days. He was thrown off and he was killed.
So for the viewers and listeners, there's YouTube as well, but there's also rather a nice bit in Burt Munro World's Fastest Indian, where he's doing his speed record, and he gets into a tank slapper and all sorts of problems. And yeah, it's luckily it's never happened to me, and I'm hopefully never going to be going fast enough to let it happen to
I've
me.
I've
So,
had it I've had it happen once, and you don't ever want to have it happen
yeah,
happen happen again.
yeah,
Yeah, so
it's
basically in those days the motorcycles were too short. Um, it was very difficult to control the relationship of center of pressure and center of gravity, and in any case, people probably didn't even know about that.
mm. One thing they certainly got right, probably without knowing it or whatever, the teardrop shape of the crash helmets that they developed. Some of those pictures of the sort of long teardrop shape helmets are very similar to the what the Olympic cyclists wear now on the time trials and things.
Almost, almost identical.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, I think they got that right. I think they definitely got that right.
Mm. But as you say, that the, the length of the motorcycle, I guess he was riding a Brough Superior, which is quite a long motorcycle to begin with, but obviously didn't do the trick. And also, you mentioned in the book about a bit of a post-mortem as far as the bike was concerned, and some stories about that were going around that there was a mechanical failure. So you covered that in the book as well.
Yes, indeed. His friends at Brooklands obviously had the wrecked machine to examine, and they came to a clear conclusion that there was no question, as had been suggested, that some of the streamlining had came loose. They said it was badly distorted, but there was no evidence that it had come loose. They basically could find no mechanical fault. There was no suggestion, no evidence of a seizure or a locking of the back wheel. It could only be put down to that instability and that speed wobble, and that was their conclusion. It was reported in Speed magazine. I think it was May 1938. That was the conclusion they'd come to.
Okay. We're sort of coming to the end now. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd particularly like to mention?
I think we should recognise that Fernihough was a serious lover of expensive sports cars. He wasn't just a two-wheeled man. I think we should record that he owned a garage on Brooklands Road, which is still there, not the original building, but the site's still there. It's a shell garage that was originally built as a garage and filling station about 1926, and Eric took it over during the 1930s, and that was his base. So he was very much, I suppose you could say, he was a Brooklands boy. You know, he was one of the locals, and was very well known in the area.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask about really was what would you say his legacy is?
Well, to some extent, I would imagine his his memory is distorted by the fact that his death was followed by by 6 years of tumultuous war. The British Motorcycle Racing Club unveiled a memorial to him at Brooklands in 1939. That was given to Eric's wife Dorothy in 1951 by the BMRCC, presumably because Brooklands was no longer a public place. It had been sold to Vickers Armstrong, I think it was. That tablet has recently surfaced in private hands and has been returned to Brooklands, where we hope it might be displayed. He's very much thought of in Hungary, and at the place where he was killed near the village of Gion, there's a roadside restaurant halfway along the record stretch, and there's a memorial to him there. And every 23rd of April, Hungarian motorcycles rally there for a wreath laying and so forth. So, in fact, perhaps rather ironically, he's better remembered in Hungary than he is in the UK. His legacy, I suppose, is of a great engineer, a very committed motorcycle racer before he turned to record breaking. He's the last Briton to have held the world's absolute motorcycle speed record, because post-war most of the activity turned to America, and particularly to Bonneville. And although there have been some efforts by British people to make good over there, it's largely been an American story. So I think basically, Eric Fernihough was a great British motorcycle hero, and is remembered as a great enthusiast and also a great engineer.
Right. Well, you've certainly put him on the map, and for me, rather than just being one of the Brooklands greats, I certainly feel I know an awful lot more about him. And thanks very much on behalf of all those future historians who will start researching world records and Fernihough. And thank you for writing what I certainly consider a two definitive works in one. That's of the man and of record breaking. So thanks very much, Terry Wright.
You're welcome.